Victorian age was an age when Britain led the world in making and inventing things. An age when engineering achievement was seen as a symbol of national greatness. Everything was getting bigger and faster. Everything was on a grand scale. The amazing thing is that all of this came from little workshops like this one of mine, where everything was done by hand. And it was all the work of talented individuals whose engineering skills were highly prized by Victorian society. They were men of unbelievable confidence and daring who achieved great things through their own brain power, enterprise and hard work. These men were the giants of their age, but for me, there were three who were rather special. This is the story of the man who covered the country with railways, the man of great versatility and vision who came up with ideas 50 years in advance of his time, and the man who turned his passion for science and technology into a great industrial empire. These were the men who transformed the face of the country and the world and turned the Victorian age into the great age of the engineer. Even before Queen Victoria came to the throne, Britain was largely an agricultural nation. There'd been the development of the steam engine and great improvements in iron making that fueled the Industrial Revolution. But a Georgian farmer, when he'd looked out from his bedroom window over there, the scene in 1820 would be something like that. With the application of the new technology to transport and the development of the world's first successful railway, from the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign to the end of it, she saw Britain change dramatically. The coming of the railways put the Industrial Revolution into top gear, and it completely changed the face of the country. It made transport all over the shore possible, moving much heavier weights than had been done before. I mean, up till these things, we were horse and carts on dirt roads and they're sinking in the mud in the winter. George Stephenson had a great interest in mechanics and he was involved in the early development of the railways. He's known as the father of the railways for building the first ones at Stockton and Darlington and Liverpool to Manchester, and for designing the first truly successful steam locomotive, Rocket. But those early locomotives were quite primitive, spindly-looking things. The man who transformed them into big, powerful engines that were capable of transporting hundreds of people at high speeds was his son Robert. That's why Robert Stephenson is one of my heroes. In the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, Robert Stephenson was in the forefront of creating a railway network which was to transform the lives of millions. It was the age of iron, the material that made it possible to make locomotives and traction engines like this one that I'm restoring here in the shed. All the machinery would all be very, very similar to this, apart from the gearing would have been exposed maybe. And of course they all relied on cow's bellies, leather belts. All locomotives and traction engines have all been made by belt-driven machinery. No fancy CNC tackles. Quite dangerous as well, I should imagine they had the first year of disasters. By the 1840s, the small workshops that had been set up by men like the Stephensons were getting bigger and more industrialised. The 4th Street Locomotive Works at Newcastle, where the Rocket had been built, was expanding rapidly. Robert Stephenson soon turned it into the biggest locomotive manufacturer in the world. Customers from far and wide would come here to discuss their requirements with Mr. Stevenson.
This is the actual office of Robert Stevenson. It's lost a bit of its past glory, but the shutters are still here and the beautiful sash windows. It has like a worldwide importance, really, because here, in this very building, the early locomotives of the world were actually drawn. This, of course, up here was the drawing office, you know, and of course it weren't quite the same as it is now, because over there were a great, all that was winded in, you know, with timber along the bottom, and nice little small panes of glass, and no doubt to stop the muck coming up from down below where all the action took place. And of course, you know, I suppose all along here there'd be great big drawing tables. It'd be quite a pleasant place even now to sit doing drawings, you know, with all the plenty of light coming through the roof. I bet Mr. Stevenson surveyed the works from up here, keeping his eye on them. You can imagine they're really going hammer and tongs in here, all the beautiful shiny brass and copper. They were lined down the middle, and of course in a way it'd be a form of mass production, but not as fast as what we know today. They maybe have 3 in a row, you know, slowly progressing with a load of people like ants crawling all over them, putting the lagging on and screwing the bits on. You really valued the skills of the mechanics and his workmen who worked for him. I've read in one book somewhere that they actually had a beer allowance, you know, if everything went well, you used to give them a barrel of bitter.
Although it was a production line, everything was still done by hand.
Somewhere very nearby, they would have had the foundry where the wheels, the cylinders would be cast. Here at the Victorian Iron Foundry at Iron Bridge Gorge Museum, you can actually see how they would have cast a locomotive wheel in like the mid-Victorian period. In fact, all the bits of steam locomotive that were made of cast iron, like the funnel, the brake box, the blast pipe, there were a heck of a lot of cast iron in a locomotive. This is a sand mould, which is like an open mould to make this wheel. And of course here we've got like the wooden pattern, which of course would be placed on a board with the box round it, this iron box, and then the sand would be put inside, and he would tamp it down with like a tamper all the way around, and then he would very carefully turn the whole box over like that, and then these little holes in this wood where they've had a tool with a spike on them, shake it about a bit, and then very carefully pull it out of the sand, and hence you've got this beautiful shape, the same shape as the wooden pattern. And of course here this is a pourer, so it doesn't splash around, and there's no chance of damaging the edge of the sand when you pour the molten metal in there, because it's very heavy, you see, and it'll run round this groove and run into the rim of the wheel and then overflow into these little holes at the side. Very important that the thing's dead level, so when you fill the mould up it's nice and flat.
And this is the sort of thing that was built there.
This engine here behind me is the only long-boilered tender mainline engine in existence, and it's a design that were done by Robert Stevenson in the 1830s. I mean, this were made quite a lot later, but it's the basic shape of it, inside cylinders and 6 wheels, had been around since 1830. You know, rapid advances were made in a very short time to a thing as big as this, from something like Stevenson's rocket, which of course is only half the size of it. Robert Stevenson and his company, of course, didn't just build locomotives, you know, they built the lines and the bridges and all the engineering works involved in the construction of a full-size railway.
The railway network grew at an amazing rate. From less than 100 miles in 1830, there were already over 1,000 miles by 1837, and within 20 years of the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, over 5,000 miles of track covered the country.
When there was a railway line to build, a man like Stevenson wouldn't let anything stand in his way. This great crack here and settlement is the result of legalised vandalism in 1845 when Robert Stevenson decided to drive a tunnel right underneath the town walls for his new railway from Chester to Holyhead.
And if you couldn't get under it or through it, you'd have to go over it.
Newcastle-on-Tyne's eye-level bridge was designed by Robert Stevenson, and it's quite an unusual structure really. It's a two-tier job, you know, the locomotives are on the top and the road traffic's underneath. It's basically a collection of cast iron arches held together by wrought iron tie rods supported by 5 sandstone pillars. It opened in 1849 by Queen Victoria, and of course it's still going strong to this day really. It's a credit to him.
Robert Stevenson was our greatest railway builder, and railways have become the symbol of Victorian industrial might. But there was another man who had an even greater impact on the Victorian age.
The man who was really Stevenson's great friend and one of his greatest rivals, were even more innovative throughout his great career. Railways, bridges, ships, the lot. Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Brunel had unshakable confidence in himself. He was so confident that he actually invested his own money in most of the projects that he undertook. His energy was immense. Like, there's no detail of any project he were involved in he wanted to know about. And I think he kept himself going, chain smoking cigars and working 20 hours a day. He earned and greatly valued the esteem with which the navvies, the shipwrights and the other engineers held him in. And they actually christened him the Little Giant, because he were only little, you see. Nearly all Stevenson's work involved railways. Brunel, on the other hand, he'd have a go at anything. His first major engineering project involved tunnelling. The tunnel under the River Thames between Wapping and Rotherhithe was handed down to Brunel by his father Mark, who was also an eminent engineer. And it's over 400 yards long, and it was the first tunnel under a river of any great size. This is a model of the tunnel as it stood in 1826. And Mark Brunel had a bit of a to-do with some planks and timber and got hurt. And then he got pleurisy, so he went into sort of semi-retirement. And he left young Isambard, who were only like 21 years old, he left him to actually complete the thing. This is the shaft that's actually outside. It would have had another bigger shaft further back with a spiral roadway in it down to the bottom. And of course the thing was supposed to be all completed in 3 years. But it didn't work like that, you know, they kept running out of money and arguing with the directors and 1 or 2 inundations. One day there were a nasty rumble and they all had run for their lives, you know. Brunel himself rescued 1 or 2 of his own workmen. Nobody got drowned though. The thing is, the water come right up to the end here and they had a big problem. To solve the problem, they bought a diving bell and they had a boat and they sailed out into the river and found the hole and they put a great sheet over it of bags of clay and hazel twigs or something, I think, and they let it all sink onto the bed of the river, and then they started the pumps off and they pumped out the water. You should imagine it'd be a wet and smelly job, and River Thames were almost an open sewer. A lot of them got affected with disease in their eyes and what have you.
It was all very dangerous, and when disaster struck again, Brunel nearly lost his life, but he'd started to build his reputation. While he was convalescing in Bristol, Brunel got to know a group of merchants and industrialists. Through them he got involved with a daring scheme to bridge the 700 feet deep Avon Gorge.
Brunel had an ability to sort out committees and boards of directors and convince them about the practical side of his ideas and his big projects. Here at Clifton, when they had the competition to build this bridge, he put in no less than 2 designs, and they had a no lesser man than Thomas Telford to be the judge. The first two designs that he submitted were turned down, and even though upset, he didn't give in. With his persuasive powers, he managed to turn round the committee's decision, and he ended up being accepted. At the beginning of its construction, one of the first things they did were to blacksmith an iron rod 2 inches diameter from one embankment to the other. And I should imagine they first started off with a piece of string and then a bit of decent rope, and then a carrier on that to have a wheel and keep pulling each rod, as it were, hammer welded on across the valley to the other side. And then they fitted it up with a carriage that them who were daft enough or, wanted desperately to get to the other side could ride in this carriage at a shilling a time, I think, to raise a bit of revenue for the directors to carry on with the job.
Unfortunately, they didn't raise enough revenue, so work on it had to be stopped, and it was only completed after his death as a memorial to him. But it was through this same group of Bristol merchants that he got involved with an ambitious project for a railway between Bristol and London. This was authorised as the Great Western Railway Company in 1835, with the 29-year-old Brunel as its first engineer.
From London to Chippenham, it were fairly flat, and they called it Brunel's billiard table. But when he got here, in between Chippenham and Bath, this great big hill, the Box Hill, which he decided that he would drive a tunnel straight through it. It involved, of course, a lot of deep cuttings, and of course the Box Tunnel here behind me, which is over 2 miles long, and at the time of its building was the longest railway tunnel ever attempted. It was a huge undertaking. Apart from the steam pumps to keep back the water, the black powder for blasting the rock, and literally hundreds of men and horses, and the whole proceedings lit by candle power. I mean, when you think about it, what an achievement.
To find out more about the sort of man he was, I went to Bristol University Library, where they have a collection of his letters and diaries.
Thank you. He was obviously a man of great ambition and drive. He spent lots of time away from home and in his family and all that. But he did keep in touch. He wrote back home from time to time. There's a lovely letter here to his wife Mary that shows what sort of a guy he were, really. He says, "I have walked today 18 miles from Bathford Bridge, and I'm not really tired." In fact, it goes a bit further on and says that if he'd have got there a bit earlier, he'd have caught the train down to London and come back on the goods train early in the morning. What a fella. Looks harder than climbing chimneys, that. He says the hotel, which is the best of a deplorable set of public houses, is full, and therefore he is staying at the Cow and Candle Snuffers. And he goes on to describe his room. There are 4 doors and 2 windows. What's the use of the doors, I can't conceive, for you might crawl under them, the gap's that big. And he ends his letter, "Goodbye, my dearest love, yours, I.K. Brunel."
Most of his engineering work on the Great Western Line, like his bridge over the Thames at Maidenhead, is still in use today. But although he was a brilliant civil engineer, his attempts at loco design were not quite as successful. So he appointed Daniel Gooch as his locomotive superintendent. Gooch was only 21, but he had a sound knowledge of steam locomotive technology. Brunel's vision was one of a complete railway system, which would include innovations in architecture, track work, locomotives, and above all, track gauge. He felt that Stephenson's 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge was too narrow, so he made his 7 feet and a quarter inch wide. But every other railway in the country standardised on the 4-foot 8.5 gauge, so it was inevitable that Brunel would eventually lose the battle of the gauges. The tracks we now travel on are Stephenson's narrower gauge.
Unfortunately, all the broad gauge locomotives on the Great Western Railway were scrapped when they turned it into 4 foot 8.5. And this here behind me is a perfect replica of one of Mr. Gooch's engines, built in 1848. And I think I'm going to go and have a little ride on it now, if the driver will let me. Yeah, what sort of speed will they get up to, these things?
They were regularly running in the 1840s and 50s, 60, 65, even 70 mile an hour. No faceplate, no cab.
You can imagine water coming off the edge of there.
Absolutely.
Anyway, shall we...
The sun always shone on the Great Western, you see.
Oh, yeah, God's wonderful railway. Yeah. It's a wheel spin, man.
Losing a D's in there a bit. Yeah. Big wheel set. But you can feel them even on the track as we've got it laid here.
Yeah.
Beautifully stable.
I wonder what he'd have been like if they'd have kept the broad gauge, you know. I mean, he was way in front of his time with Mr. Brunel, weren't he?
You'll see pictures in the old days, in the 1840s, 50s. 60s when these were on the go. You did see derailments, but you never actually saw a broad gauger on its side. You'd go down the bank and across the ploughed field and still be standing.
It's a man-sized reversing lever.
Oh, yes.
Here we go. Next stop, Bristol.
Right away, mate.
But Bristol wasn't the last stop, because when he was building the Great Western, he developed an even more ambitious plan for linking the railway with a fleet of ships, so that you would be able to buy a through ticket from London to New York.
Brunel decided that all his ships would be powered by steam. His first ship, the Great Western, weighed 1,320 tons, and of course it was made of wood. And it was launched in 1837, and it proved that a steam-propelled ship could actually get to America and back. Brunel had realised that they'd come to the limit with the wooden business, you know, building ships out of wood, so for the next one he'd got to use iron. And this here, the SS Great Britain, is made of wrought iron plates that were actually bent and formed in the very dock where it were built and riveted together, and of course it's clinker built like a rowing boat. Layers of plates are lapped one over the other. And I think they're about 6 feet long and about 2 foot 6 deep. That is about the biggest weight at the time that could be lifted up in like a bloom, as they used to call them, and shove it under the hammer, flatten it out into an ingot, and then shove it through the rollers and make it into an iron plate. When the bloom had passed through the rollers several times, you know, and it terminated as a long iron bar or a piece of angle iron, or any fancy shape you wanted they could do, really, like half rounds and all of that, octagonal shaped pieces for making nuts out of. And of course this bit here is a plate that would be very similar to the ones that the SS Great Britain were made from. In the middle of the 19th century, they actually made about 3 million tonnes of this stuff every year. And of course it furnished all the locomotive works, the shipyards and everything. Having got the plates for building, say, a ship, you've got to join them together, you know, and of course the first thing was to drill thousands of holes. And I think that a lot of it were done while they were flat, you know, on the floor, but this creation here is what's termed as a ratchet drill, creation of the devil. And this is like a very laborious way to drill holes by hand through, say, 1.5 inches of iron or 2 half-inch plates. And of course, as you can see, it takes a bit of doing. And of course, then when they drilled all the holes, you've got to do the riveting. But unlike my feeble efforts, they'd have an army of blokes. There'd be one man on the furnace, on the forge, and one man inside holding up, and the other guy with the hammer. So as soon as it appeared, he could put the head on. I know some would, after a day of doing this, you wouldn't have to go to the L Club, you know, for any exercise. Aye.
There was nothing in between the plates, maybe a coat of red lead or something like that, but just the rivets alone, you know, wouldn't make it waterproof. So all the edges of the seams had all got to be caught with a contraption like this. You know, in shipyards, they all must have been quite deaf and mad with the noise. You can imagine, you know, 500 or 600 blokes in all of a ship all with one of these. We must have been like bedlam and all. But any rivets that weren't quite finished off, you could go around the edges with a caulking hammer and swell the metal up so that the water didn't come in. When work started on this ship, it was going to be the world's biggest paddle steamer. But it was soon proved by another smaller iron ship, the Archimedes, that had a prop on it, a screw, propeller, that propeller propulsion for ships were much better in ocean-going conditions. And so they changed everything and turned the engine through 90 degrees and made it into one driven with a prop. When the Queen visited the ship, Brunel gave her a guided tour of the engine rooms and showed her how it all worked, you know, and she's reputed to have been amazed by the sheer size of it all.
By this time, Brunel was becoming one of the best-known figures of the age, and his projects were attracting massive publicity and public interest. All the papers of the day had special coverage of the launch of the Great Britain, which took place in the presence of Prince Albert, who had travelled from London on Brunel's new Great Western Railway. The Queen's husband was a great science and technology enthusiast. He was the driving force behind the Great Exhibition, which was held in 1851, to demonstrate the industrial supremacy and prosperity of Britain. It was opened by the Queen in a magnificent ceremony attended by ambassadors from all over the world. And afterwards she said this was the greatest day in our history, and it was the happiest and proudest day in my life. With the Great Exhibition, the heroic age of engineering reached its peak, and the men who had given Britain its industrial might had become the leading figures of the day. Prince Albert was their patron, and Brunel named his Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash after him as a tribute. The bridge is one of his masterpieces. It's the only railway carrying suspension bridge in the country, and a magnificent engineering achievement. His confidence in taking on projects like this was amazing.
Here I've actually got this private diary, and I found some in it earlier that's quite incredible. The projects that he discussed in here privately are quite shocking, really. I mean, there's one here regarding a proposed suspension bridge over the River Thames, and it says, "I have condescended to do this work, but I won't be giving it much time," sort of thing. I mean, if only the directors have managed to get their hands on that, you know. Here in the library, I've discovered something about one of his failures, the South Devon Atmospheric Railway. It was an absolute disaster, but he had great faith at the beginning that, you know, he could make it work. But he was also warned by Stevenson and Daniel Gooch that the thing, you know, was a bit iffy. Brunel didn't invent the atmospheric railway, but he proposed its development enthusiastically for a railway from Exeter to Plymouth, and he was appointed the consulting engineer for the whole job. This here is my sort of idea of roughly how the atmospheric railway works, as you might say. It never really worked, actually. The thing is, basically, all it were an iron pipe, a cast iron pipe, with a slot in the bottom, which of course is this pipe here, with a carriage above with like a knife blade hanging down into a slot in top of the pipe. Yeah, really, a good explanation of it to anybody who's like over middle age is if you remember going to the co-op with your mum when you were little, you know, for the groceries, and there was this strange sort of collection of pipes that almost looked like large bore central heating pipes. And they give the man behind the counter the change and the money, and he like go to this strange looking cupboard door in the middle of it all, and opening there a hissing noise, and he put all the change in a thing that were a bit bigger than a bean tin with two rubber O-rings round each end. And when he bobbed it in, it just, it shot away up the pipe. And of course, magic for a small child, The thing is, that they worked off the atmosphere, and then within a second or two, it sort of reappeared with the thing called the divvy, I think, and your change. Quite magic. It always fascinated me as a kid. I'd never ever heard of the atmospheric railway then. Yeah, there only ever a short length of it ever worked from Exeter to Newton Abbot, and that very spasmodically. Brunel had to admit to the directors and defeat and failure, the most costly engineering disaster of all times up till then. In spite of all his confidence, he was pretty insecure. I mean, here it says, everything's prospered, everything at the moment is sunshine. I don't like it, it can't last. Bad weather must surely come. Let me see the storm in time to gather in the sails. Yeah, a bit of insecurity there, a bit, I worry like that sometimes. Things can't keep going on like they are. And for Brunel, they didn't. His restless energy and his constant search for new ways of doing things led to bigger and bigger projects, which meant taking bigger risks. His last was the biggest and riskiest of them all, and it's the one that led him to an early grave. In 1851, Brunel drew up plans for an even bigger ship, 4 times as big as this, that would sail all the way to Australia and back without having to stop off anywhere for any coal. To do this, he went into partnership with an eminent naval architect at the time and shipbuilder called John Scott Russell. Plans initially were drawn up by Scott Russell for the monster of the seas. It was to be propelled by 3 different sources of power, 2 ginormous paddle wheels on each side, and then 1 single screw at the back, driven by a separate engine, and it also had 6 masts. So, when they run out of coal, they'd be all right. Brunel had been appointed the chief engineer of the whole project, and Scott Russell had had his hopelessly inadequate tender accepted at $225,000, and of course from the word go they were bothered. Scott Russell were building, I think, 2 other ships on the same slipway, and I think there were a bit of jiggery pokery with about 1,000 ton of iron plates that went astray somewhere, but Mr. Brunel had it all written down in his ledgers. The letters between the 2 of them got steadily worse as things went on. It says here, I must beg of you to look back, this is Brunel to Scott Russell, I must beg of you to look back at the several letters I have written to you in weeks past. The time has arrived at which the work of the launching way should have been commenced, and you know my views. Let the plans be prepared immediately, and something be done before your next payment. In other words, if he don't take his finger out, he ain't going to get paid. Work continued on the Great Eastern on the Isle of Dogs. It bankrupted Mr. Scott Russell. Brunel took over, and with all the troubles he'd had building the damn thing, it made poor Brunel, it broke his spirit and made him ill. This is a place I've always really wanted to come and visit. Here on the 31st of January in 1858, after 13 attempts, they finally got the great ship into the river, with the aid of dozens of hydraulic rams with sides about 18 inches thick, and pushing it inch by inch. Down it went. Of course, it had changed a bit round here since then. These flats, of course, weren't here. And they've raised the banks of the River Thames. This would be where I'm standing now, more or less the original shoreline. It was launched sideways as well. Lots of people think boats all go in back end first, but this one didn't. It went in sideways. The thing is that when finally it did get in the water, there were even more trouble afoot when somebody forgot to turn a tap off, and a feed water heater for the boilers exploded and blew the funnel off the deck. Did quite a lot of damage. And the last known picture of Isambard Kingdom Brunel is stood on the deck when he's got leaning on a stick, minus his tall hat,
and he don't look an happy man at all. In fact, he had, I think, a stroke, and he was very ill, and he went home and died shortly afterwards.
Brunel's great friend Robert Stevenson, who'd remained a staunch supporter throughout all his troubles with the Great Eastern, died within a few weeks of him.
Really, Robert Stevenson and Brunel were friends all through the careers, you know, even though they were rivals, but they helped each other with technical details and when they were in trouble. I mean, here's a lovely letter from Stevenson to Brunel. I shall always be at hand, happen what may, to aid and do everything in my power, and without shirking any responsibility if need be. Really, they must have been good mates, you know, in big trouble. I mean, a brain as big as Stevenson's be a big help, I should imagine.
Their deaths brought to an end the heroic age of engineering, when one man of great drive and energy could take on a whole project from start to finish. From the 1860s onwards, we see the beginning of a new era. It was the start of the corporate age, a time of increased specialisation when engineers became businessmen and built up great industrial empires. None was bigger than the company that was set up in Newcastle by a third giant of the age of Victoria, William Armstrong.
In Victorian times, were great interest shown in engineering and science. And ambitious young men of the period, if they wanted to be engineers, there were a fair chance that they could become very rich, you know. In a way, engineering companies were like the dot-com companies of the time. William Armstrong really were actually a lawyer, but he had this other interest in science and technology, and of course one of his great things were hydraulics. It's an astonishing fact that Armstrong never had any formal training in engineering. Everything he knew he taught himself. And at the beginning of his company, for the first 15 years, he never had a holiday, you know, a bit like me, really. And he were dedicated to the job. If there were a great problem wanted solving, you know, he didn't even go home. He would sleep on the job. By 1847, Armstrong had given up practicing law, and he opened his Elsick Works on the banks of the River Tyne, where he manufactured hydraulic cranes and all sorts of other engineering equipment like lathes and steam engines and steam pumps.
The business was a huge success and went on to provide engines and hydraulic machinery for some of the greatest civil engineering projects of the Victorian age, including Tower Bridge and the Manchester Ship Canal.
When work first started on the canal, W.G. Armstrong and Company were awarded the contract for all the hydraulics, the full length from Liverpool to Manchester, and these worked all the locks, the craneage and everything. But the most impressive bit is this, the Barton Swing Aqueduct. Just above my head there's 800 tons of water in a big iron tank, which is actually a slice out of the Bridgewater Canal that the Grand Old Duke of Bridgewater built to get his coals to Manchester. Yeah, when I was a small boy, my dad used to bring me along the road from Bolton on my bike, and he used to say it was the 8th wonder of the world, and I really believed him. You know, it is in a way. I mean, it's a magnificent piece of Victorian mechanicking at its best.
Mr. Armstrong's hydraulic engines that turns the shaft, swings the bridge, and it's been here working for over 100 years. That's why it's got a few knocks and a few leaks. Really a credit to Victorian engineering.
Many people contributed to Armstrong's empire. The world of men like Stephenson and Brunel, when they built the Clifton Bridge and Stephenson built the Britannia Bridge, they could safely say it was the work of like each of them men. But here on the Manchester Ship Canal, it involved a lot of engineers like Armstrong, Andrew Andyside, who did all the ironwork, the bridges, and of course the men who dug the actual cut itself. After the age of Brunel and Stephenson, we no longer associate big engineering feats with just one man.
Armstrong grew rich beyond his wildest dreams, and he was able to build a great house for himself at Cragside in Northumberland. The house is a sign of how far the engineer had come. It's all a far cry from the miner's cottage where Robert Stephenson was brought up, and from the little workshops where it had all started. But it was wealth based not just on cranes, pumps and bridges, but on tools the growing empire had need of: arms.
Up until the Crimean War, all ordnance and artillery had been muzzle loading. That means they had to shove the projectile down the spout. And this, of course, stirred Armstrong's inventive brain to construct the breech loader. This is an early breech loader, which means actually it's loaded from the rear end, which were a grand advantage. The early muzzle loaders, which have been around since sailing ship days, they just fired round projectiles, which of course had a nasty habit of flying off sideways, and Armstrong ended up with the rifling up the spout, and of course the shell, the projectile, with a lead coat on it, so it dug into the rifling and caused it to fly through the air with a twist, and of course it did definitely keep it in a much straighter line. By the 1860s, the demand for the Elsick cannon was worldwide. Even both sides of the American Civil War had Armstrong guns firing at each other.
At Armstrong's Elsick Works, there'll be lots of machines like this, all driven by belts and powered by steam. And of course there'll be many, many articles that won't cut into length, like iron bars like this and shafts. And of course great tubes for his cannons. I've actually got a picture of one of these in the Engineers magazine, but it's 9 feet long and will cut 15 inches diameter. This is only a little one, really.
By 1867, the Armstrong Company had begun to build iron warships, and in the first 15 years they built 20. And in the last quarter of the last century, they became like world leaders in armaments and warship building.
At Elsick, he could build a battleship right from the blast furnace through to the thing finished and ready for him to launch it.
By this time, he'd become a lord, and he'd also become a great landowner. And this here is his parlour, very beautiful, and he must have made a lot of money. And here he entertained foreign envoys and princes who'd all come down to have a look at his big guns. And of course, at first he was very patriotic. He only sold them to the British government, but they terminated his contract, and then he threw patriotism through the window and started selling them to everybody all over the world and became the greatest armament supplier of the time. The Japanese Navy were amongst the best customers of Armstrong's shipbuilding plant, and by the beginning of the next century, when they went to war with the Russians, over half the Japanese fleet had been made here at the Elsick Works on the River Tyne. Most of the Russian fleet had been built a bit further down the River Tyne by Hawthorne Leslies and Swan Hunters. Of course, it must have been great fun on a Saturday night up the pubs in Newcastle when the Russians had blown one of Armstrong's out the water and Armstrong's had blown, it was a bit like rival football fans, it must have been quite an age.
By the 1890s, the manufacture of arms and battleships had become one of our major industries. Armstrong had turned a brilliantly successful engineering works
into a symbol of imperial might here at this spot. Down there they made all the battleships, kept extending and extending all the way to the Scots woodworks which were up there. In fact, at home, in my shed, I've got a riveting hammer that says Sir W.G. Armstrong, Scots Woodworks, Newcastle on Tyne. So I know they made riveting hammers up there. What an empire it must have been. When you look now, there's only one ship inside, a two-masted schooner over there. Nothing, you know, all gone. All this modern, I don't know, what is it, offices.
So, what went wrong? Well, everything was like on a small scale like this. Things seemed to be quite going well, you know, and fine, but when the big industrial giants started to take over, and I think we lost some of the individual spark that had made engineering exciting and heroic. The work of Stevenson and Brunel had been recognisably theirs, but by the end of the century, the spirit of men like them had been swallowed up in the corporate world. It's a bit ironic that Armstrong had given up the law to pursue his passion for science and engineering, and he finished up as a businessman running a vast corporate empire. By the end, he spent all his time at Cragside, and he died there on the 22nd of December 1900, less than a month before Queen Victoria. But it was thanks to the efforts of men like Armstrong, Brunel and Stevenson that the Queen saw Britain change beyond all recognition during the course of her reign, turning it from a land of farmers to an industrial giant dominating the world and ruling over a vast empire.
They left us a wonderful legacy. Some of the bridges that stand today, that they built, to me, quite beautiful and stunning and magic.
But the main thing they left for us was their engineering expertise. The lines of the Clifton Suspension Bridge can still be seen in the great suspension bridges of today, like the one over the Humber. The basic principles of hydraulics as developed by Armstrong are still used today in great civil engineering projects like the Thames Barrier. What would Brunel have made of the Channel Tunnel? If he'd have been around today, I'm sure it would have been Brunel's Channel Tunnel. It'd have been nice to have been around back in them days in a little workshop just like this.
I'd have been an happy man then, putting all the poverty and awful things that there were in the Victorian period aside. I think if you were a mechanical bent, you could survive then. Like, I reckon I'd have been all right. I don't think I'd have been out of work.
You could discover more about the lives and times of some of my Victorian heroes and their great engineering achievements by visiting the BBC History website.